Hello, Matthew Bell with AlzheimersProof.com, and today I want to talk a little bit about the question of whether or not there is a link between Alzheimer's disease and attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. Now, my older son has ADHD, and my mom is a school teacher, and so she has been in the process of kind of investigating some of these things about ADHD and trying to provide information to me. And in virtue of some of her reading and some of the things that she watched, she came across this idea that there might be somehow a connection between ADHD and Alzheimer's disease. There's going to be a couple of aspects to this. I want to get right to the kind of nitty-gritty of it. The consensus opinion in terms of the very high-profile articles that are given attention and given pride of place by Google in its ranking system all want to de-emphasize any kind of link between ADHD and Alzheimer's. Specifically, the main websites that I consulted, this would be Mayo Clinic and WebMD, and then there's an actual specialty site just for ADHD called attitude.com. And that particular site also, in very brief articles, these websites quote from doctors and other people who are very dismissive of the idea that there's any kind of connection between ADHD and Alzheimer's disease. And I am not a doctor, I'm not a medical professional of any kind, so I certainly am in no position to gainsay the doctor from the standpoint of the medical question of whether or not there's a link between Alzheimer's disease and ADHD. So the upshot is that, and just to put it very plainly, there is no accepted link between ADHD and Alzheimer's disease, and certainly people want to be careful about any speculation that might cause a person to worry that ADHD might cause Alzheimer's disease. And I get that, and I certainly would not want to be a party to any alarmism or anything like that. But I felt like it was worth at least commenting on this question because my training is more philosophical. I get more into the idea of cause. So this is one of the reasons why this has become an issue, or at least why this was presented to me as an issue. My mom, again, brought it to my attention. Here you can see this website is Live Science, and the article is titled, "Adults with ADHD May Face Higher Risk of Dementia," from July the 5th of 2017, author Sarah Miller. And if you scroll down, it says, "Adults with ADHD may have an increased risk of developing dementia later in life, a new study from Taiwan finds." And so it says, in the study, adults who had been diagnosed with ADHD were more than 3 times more likely to later be diagnosed with dementia compared with adults who did not have ADHD. Then it goes into the prevalence of ADHD and the prevalence of Alzheimer's. So you can see here 8 to 12% of children worldwide with ADHD, and 47 million people worldwide currently with at least some form of dementia, not necessarily Alzheimer's, but or other forms as well. And then you can see here the spelling out of this connection in the study in terms of the correlation between these adults who were followed, I guess, somewhat longitudinally. They were followed over a 10-year period of time and found that they were 3.4 times more likely to be diagnosed with dementia than those without ADHD. Now, it's important to say here that the researchers did not look into the possible causes that could be behind this link. So it is simply a correlation at this point, and you can see here that the underlying mechanism that could connect the two conditions remains unclear. Now, there's also a noteworthy reservation here beyond that. It says here that the researchers noted that the study had several limitations, however, in part because the database they used in the research only included information from insurance claims. In other words, the database showed whether people had been diagnosed with dementia or ADHD, but little else. For example, the researchers didn't have information about family history, education levels, or diet, and those factors may have played a role, and that's this paragraph right here. In addition, the study authors noted that the diagnoses included in the analysis were not made uniformly, and it's possible that some people in the control group had ADHD but were not diagnosed with it, so they were undiagnosed. Of course, it's also possible, presumably, that there are people with undiagnosed Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia. Perhaps they would have early onset or an early stage of it and then die from some other cause unrelated before they have an opportunity to be diagnosed. But nevertheless, these are important reservations here. Now, when you go on to the various different websites, just search on, is there a connection between ADHD and Alzheimer's? This is the Women's Alzheimer's Movement. You can see here it's a very brief article. This is it right here.
is there a connection between ADHD and Alzheimer's? And 3 different professors here, PhD, 2 of them PhD holders, and one, some unspecified, perhaps an MD, who are quoted, and each of them, the consensus is, for example, the first one, there's very little evidence linking ADHD risk to Alzheimer's. It is certainly not a risk factor according to the first doctor. The second, I am not aware of studies that find a link between ADHD and Alzheimer's disease later in life. It's not a well-accepted risk factor. And the third doctor says no good studies that I know of have shown a link between the two. I think some older people with attentional deficits get called adult onset ADHD when they are actually in the early stages of dementia. So here's a good point, that it may even be a mistake to identify the lapses in executive function or memory or other things as ADHD in adults. It could be early stages of dementia itself. So the consensus from the doctors polled here is that there is no connection. Then again, we go to WebMD, ADHD now, dementia later, and it says adults with ADHD symptoms have tripled risk of dementia. Later study finds, and then this is actually a different study, it looks like here, in January of 2011, this article was published, and it says this is research from Argentina. So the separate study here also finding an elevated risk in later life. But the idea here is really the focus was Lewy body dementia, and there's a reference to Alzheimer's disease, but here basically a US-based expert cautions that the study found an association between ADHD symptoms and the dementia, not cause and effect. So again, this is not a causal hypothesis here. This is simply a correlation, and you can read more about that on WebMD. The final thing that I'll draw your attention to here is just the brief reference to it on the Attitude mag, ADD Etude magazine, I guess, here for attention deficit disorder and other kinds of attention problems here. This is also from a PhD author, Thomas Brown, and the title of this brief article here is Can Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD, Cause Alzheimer's or Dementia? He essentially answers the question in terms of cause with one word here, no. No, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, cannot cause Alzheimer's. Now, this is what I'm mostly going to be addressing here. This cannot cause. With ADHD, we're dealing with a problem that has to do with chemical dynamics of dopamine, a neurotransmitter responsible for movement and mood regulation, and norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter associated with the fight or flight response. But with Alzheimer's, the brain's wiring is destroyed by a thick glop that accumulates on the neurons. So the only thing I want to comment on essentially, and I'll do this briefly here, as briefly as I can, is this cannot cause, which is very strong. And the second thing, that saying that Alzheimer's is characterized by this glop that accumulates on the neurons. Now, of course, that's true. That is very true. But do we know that the thick glop that accumulates on the neurons is not at base the result of, quote, chemical dynamics of dopamine or the chemical dynamics of norepinephrine? Now, current research doesn't suggest that those are the causal mechanisms. I'm not disputing that at all, and I'm not saying that this doctor doesn't know what he's talking about. He's trying to diffuse some of the alarmism, and it's very responsible for somebody to say at the present time there is no reason for panic. But, if you have an ADHD diagnosis, there's no reason for panic that you're going to eventually inevitably get Alzheimer's. All of that is true. But at the same time, the thing that gives me pause is this idea that it cannot cause. Well, the current state of the science really is that we don't know what causes Alzheimer's disease definitively. Even though it is certainly characterized by glop that accumulates on the neurons, we are not in a position to understand precisely what precipitates the accumulation of that glop, and therefore there could be at some future time a discovery of some deeper connection between these two conditions that has to do with the underlying brain chemistry and affects both. So that's the only caveat. As far as that goes, it's mostly a philosophical and academic point. The current state of the science is absolutely the case that there's no connection that's definitive.
One of the things that occurred to me in reading through these articles was simply the fact that, number one, Alzheimer's disease, the cause of Alzheimer's disease, is not well established. Now, when you think about the consequence of that, the consequence of it not being well established is essentially that we're not for sure what causes Alzheimer's disease. And so when you have a kind of a question like that, it seems like an open question as to whether or not some other condition might be causally related to Alzheimer's, because we can't rule it out. Now, having said that, there are cases where we might not know what a thing is. We might not know what the answer is, but we can have a pretty good idea of what it is not. So, for instance, if I ask a true and false question, you might not know the answer to the question, but you can be sure that the answer is not the numeral 4, for example. If it is a true and false question, then the answer is either true or false, so you can be sure that the answer is not shoe, or the answer is not 4, the answer is not, mountaintop, right? The answer to the question is somehow, even though we don't know what the answer is, we have a pretty good idea of what it is not. So it might be a case in this particular instance where researchers may not know what causes Alzheimer's disease, but they can be fairly certain that it is not ADHD. But just for conceptual purposes, let me just put up on the screen some of the different conceptual ways that things can be causally related, and maybe this will make a little bit more sense. This is going to be a somewhat abstract video compared to some of the others that I have done, and I feel like that is important because of the fact that this topic is bumping up against a very philosophically rich issue, and that is the issue of causation. So when two things are related to one another, let's say A and B, they can be causally related or causally unrelated in any of a number of ways. So the first way would be A could cause B. So if A causes B, then it's a straightforward instance of one thing causing another. I'm going to sideline the question of what causation comes down to. But actually, just conceptually, when we have two things related, A and B, and we're asking the question of how they might be related causally, one option is that A could cause B. Now, another option would be that B could cause A. So, for example, if A is ADHD and B is Alzheimer's disease, it is possible conceptually that ADHD causes Alzheimer's disease, but it's equally possible, just from a conceptual standpoint, forgetting about any empirical evidence that we have at all, it is conceptually possible that Alzheimer's causes ADHD. Now you might think, well, that would be an absurd way of understanding the relationship, and I would tend to agree, since for no other reason, in many cases, a child is going to manifest ADHD, but not Alzheimer's disease, and a very elderly person might manifest Alzheimer's disease. And so if there's any kind of causal direction, just because of the time, the temporality involved in it, it would seem to make more sense that ADHD would cause Alzheimer's disease than the other way around. But my point is only that in concept, in logical space, there is the option when two things are related, we are not sure what the causal direction might be. Now, a third option is going to be that A and B could both be caused by some now as of yet undetermined third cause. Let's call it C. So the third option would be that A and B could both be caused by C. And the fourth option, just to kind of keep things simple, would be that A is caused by some other cause. It's not caused by B. Let's say it's caused by C, but that B is caused by something else entirely, and we'll just call that D. So if they're causally unrelated, they might be correlated in some interesting way. But if they're causally unrelated, then presumably A would have its own cause, we'll call it C, and B would have its own cause, we'll call that D. So in the case that we're dealing with presently, with Alzheimer's disease and with ADHD, if they are causally related, it could be that ADHD causes Alzheimer's, it could be that Alzheimer's causes ADHD, it could be that both ADHD and Alzheimer's are caused by some third, as of yet undetermined cause, or it could be that Alzheimer's disease is caused by one thing or many, and ADHD is caused by something else or some combination of things that is causally unrelated to those causes of Alzheimer's disease. I know this is somewhat abstract, but here's my point in saying this. In the articles that I looked at, researchers, for example, will say, well, ADHD has this as a cause. It's some kind of an imbalance in this brain chemistry, and ADHD and Alzheimer's disease is a different imbalance dealing with different brain chemistry. And that's true. I mean, on the face of it, that is absolutely true. The hesitation that I have is because our knowledge of what actually causes Alzheimer's. So let's just use one example. Alzheimer's, one of the hypotheses is that Alzheimer's is caused by various plaques and tangles in the brain. ADHD is not characterized by the same kinds of plaques and tangles. So right there, researchers can point to an obvious cleavage between ADHD and Alzheimer's disease. However, the point is that can we rule out the fact that some kind of change in brain chemistry that causes ADHD also later in life, let's say, causes the generation of plaques and tangles? It doesn't seem to me like the state of the evidence permits us to rule that out. But would it be called ADHD causing Alzheimer's? Well, that would be a matter of semantics in part, but it seems probably in a case like what I just sketched, that if both ADHD and Alzheimer's disease have another cause to both of them, some other factor that causes ADHD in a young person and causes the accumulation of plaques and tangles in somebody who's older, we're probably going to think of that as a third-party cause situation where, let's say, C causes A and B. So some other, as of yet undetermined cause precipitates both ADHD and Alzheimer's disease. But we just don't know. There's not enough information. There's no reason, though, and I want to state this, I stated it at the outset, and I want to say it again, there's no reason to be panicky if you have a youngster, as I do, who has ADHD, even if Alzheimer's runs in a family, which it certainly runs in mine. My dad, Jim, died of Alzheimer's in 2016. My grandma passed of Alzheimer's on my mom's side in June. She died, I should say, with Alzheimer's. She had Alzheimer's when she died. She died actually of a heart failure, but in terms of her total health picture, she had Alzheimer's disease according to her doctor. The point is that Alzheimer's presumably runs in my family, and yet with my son having ADHD, I'm not going to get overly panicked that he's going inevitably to end up with Alzheimer's disease. But at the same time, my hesitation in just wanting to say, oh, there's absolutely no connection whatsoever, well, I think that has to be. It has to be the verdict that that is, as of yet, an undetermined thing. We just simply do not know at this present time all the complexities of brain chemistry. It could very well be that there is some kind of a connection between the two because they are both characterized by changes in brain chemistry that are so complex that researchers are only scratching the surface in terms of both conditions, in understanding the onset of these, in understanding how to effectively treat them, how to effectively treat symptoms, and so on. Once again, there's no reason for alarmism, but at the same time, I'm going to stop short. This is not me commenting from a medical standpoint. I have no authority when it comes to medical decisions. I am not at all gainsaying these doctors when it comes to their considered medical opinions. But I guess what I'm saying is, in this case, I think that what is being commented on goes beyond the medical evidence. It starts to get into a question of causation. And causation is in the purview of something called metaphysics, which is a branch of philosophy. So when doctors are commenting on causation, they're essentially going a bit beyond what the medical evidence actually suggests, and they're starting to comment on metaphysics. And they're being a bit philosophical, which is totally appropriate. They can absolutely do that, but so can a person who has a bit of training in metaphysics, and I would simply say that we should be a little bit circumspect before we simply definitively state that Alzheimer's disease and ADHD have no causal connection whatsoever because, as I said, due to the state of the science in both areas of study, we simply don't have enough information to rule out definitively that there is some connection between those two conditions. Now, this has been an extremely abstract topic. I hope that something that I said may have been of interest or at least provocative. I am not at all trying to make a final determination on any of these questions. If you found something of value, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell to be alerted to new content. Most of the content that I produce is not abstract or dealing with philosophical issues as this one kind of is. Things that you can do in terms of dietary changes, in terms of lifestyle changes to try and reduce your risk of Alzheimer's disease. There are things that I have dealing with herbs. I have things dealing with mainstream pharmaceuticals, modifications that you can perform to the home environment to make your caretaking duties a little bit easier, interventions around the house, how to change locks, how to secure bookshelves, many pieces of content on long-term care, getting long-term care, the ins and outs of paying for long-term care, and there's all kinds of different topics that I go into, and I invite you to check those out. I thank you so much for being with me today, and I look forward to seeing you again in another video. Thank you.